Before we begin with the questions today, I would like to take a moment to join the Anchorage Chamber of Commerce to thank the Linden Corporation, this quarter's sponsor of the Make It Monday Forum. Sponsors like these enable the Anchorage Chamber to keep providing informative and affordable presentations for you each week. So thank you very much to our sponsor, Linden. I'll tell you a little bit about the structure of today's program. We're going to start with a 90-second introduction from each of the candidates. They'll have that opportunity to make an opening statement, talk about what their priorities are and the issues that they would like to advance. From there, we'll move on to a yes or no portion of the debate, where I'll pose a question to all four candidates simultaneously, and then ask them to raise a ping pong tab that on one side has yes, and on the other side has no. So that they can indicate their position on any questions I've just asked them. From there, we'll turn it over to four questions that have been posed by the Legislative Committee of the Anchorage Chamber of Commerce, and we'll give the candidates an opportunity to respond to those questions in a 2-minute period. We'll then transition to an opportunity for the questions to ask, for the candidates to ask questions of each other. They'll get 30 seconds to pose their question. The candidate to whom that question is asked will get 1 minute for a response, and then we'll return to the original questioner for a 1-minute rebuttal. If we have time, I'm going to take some questions from the audience. So if there are issues that have not been covered yet today, we would certainly appreciate your input on what you'd like the questions to respond, or the candidates to respond to. On your table are some blank index cards. If you could jot your questions down there, and if once you've done so, raise them high. We have a couple people who will circulate the room, grab those from you, and get them up to me so we have a chance, provided we have some time toward the end, to pose some of those questions to the candidates. To close the debate, then, we're going to return to the candidates for a 1-minute closing statement from each of them, and that should bring us just about to 1:15 this afternoon. So I think we'll go ahead and get started then. Let's begin all the way over at the far left of the stage. If we could have Mr. Coffey begin with a 90-second opening statement, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dan Coffey. I've run a totally open campaign. I put my tax returns and a transcript from the paid conversation on my website about a year ago. I wanted to talk about the facts of that conversation. In 2008, after an assembly meeting, I was in my car with a colleague from the assembly having what I thought was a private conversation. That conversation was taped. I've repeatedly tried to get a copy of the tape, haven't been successful. I've never had my hands on the tape, and I've never even heard the tape itself. I was able to get a transcript from a court recorder, and that's what I posted on my website back in February, March of last year. If I had the tape today, I would play the tape for all of you today so that you could hear what was said. What you would hear, in part, was laughter at the time I was making my comments. As the Daily News said in the 2008 editorial, and it's a quote, Dan, quote, was laughing at the time, so let's assume he didn't mean it. And I did not. My comments were intended to be humorous, but in the light of day, they're not funny. In fact, they're just a stupid jest, and I am somewhat embarrassed for having even said it in private. Since I couldn't get the tape, I contacted a lawyer to find out what you do with those kinds of conversations. He did his legal research and wrote a letter to several broadcasters. I asked him to inform them, not threaten them. I'm not going to sue anybody. I never had any intention of suing anybody. I want to finish by saying in all my years of public service, I have never violated any code of ethics. And I've been in public service a lot and for a long time. Nevertheless, some of my opponents are taking me to task for my poor humor.
Mr. Coffey, I'm going to keep you on time, Mr. Coffey, because we have a lot of questions and a lot of issues to get through. Mr. Berkowitz, you have your response for your opening statement for 90 seconds, please.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much. My name is Ethan Berkowitz, and I'm running for mayor because my wife and I, we've got 2 kids in the public school here. I'm invested in this community, part owner of Snow City Cafe, Spinard Roadhouse. We're opening one in South Anchorage called South. If anyone wants to eat there, go ahead. That'll be great. I appreciate that. But in the time since I left the legislature in 2006, I spent 10 years there. I worked on a number of projects. Worked with a company called Strategies 360, which is about strategic positioning. I've worked with developing a fiber optic line between Pluto and Fairbanks. That was a private exercise, private enterprise. And I worked with the city of Nolan developing a public-private partnership to bring geothermal energy to that community. So that's what I've been doing in addition to being a radio talk show host, and I apologize if I intruded on any of your mornings for that. But I'm running because I think Anchorage can be safer, more secure, and stronger moving ahead. When I talk about safety, I mean public safety, more officers. When I talk about security, we need to deal with the homeless issue, and first, it starter homes for people, as well as making sure we have the wherewithal to deal with the state's fiscal problem. When I talk about stronger, that means a quality level of education, as well as the right type of infrastructure so Anchorage can compete and succeed in the 21st century. Thank you.
Mr. Halcro, 90 seconds for your opening statement.
Thank you. I don't know whoever said you can never go home again, because they obviously were never the past president of the Anchorage Chamber of Commerce, because I can really feel like I'm home again. So, for those of you who know, for the last 2 years I've been president of the Anchorage Chamber of Commerce. I want to take a minute very publicly, because I've never had this opportunity, to thank 5 people in this room that made the last 2 years at the Chamber an unbelievable experience. Brenda, Van, Corey, Megan, Caleb, those folks that you see every Monday are amazing people, and they make this organization run. 2 years ago, the staff and I promised the board of directors that we would move the Anchorage Chamber of Commerce from the top 4% of all chambers of commerce in the country to the top 1%. And we promised we would do that by 2015 because this year is our 100th anniversary. And 2 weeks ago, we were notified by the United States Chamber of Commerce that we were successful. And today, your Anchorage Chamber of Commerce is in the top 1% of all chambers of commerce in the United States. This is what I want to do for Anchorage.
Ms. Demboski, you have an opportunity now for a 90-second opening statement.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to stand here before you today. I decided to make the run for mayor because I truly believed we needed someone who had a laser focus, not only on what's a good return on investment for the taxpayers, but what the city of Anchorage needs, and that's public safety, infrastructure, and education. We can't do those things right unless we have sound fiscal policy. As the only current city assembly member running today, I feel like I have a unique perspective. I've had the opportunity for the last 2 years to serve the people of Chugach, Eagle River, and Jaybear, as well as every other taxpayer here in the city of Anchorage. It's been my privilege to strengthen the ethics code. It's been my privilege to repeal some fines and fees, and to, when the opportunity presented itself, give money back to the taxpayers. It's been a great privilege to serve on the assembly the last couple of years. There's an incredible group of people that I've had the opportunity to meet and work with, not just that sit currently in office, but those in the public that recognize that collaboration and working together, we really can get things done for the city. And when I say, I'm very proud of my record when it comes to ethics, because I believe a good government is a transparent government. A good government is one in which our leaders are held to the highest standard, because it's your seats that we hold. And I think that's imperative, and so I'm glad to be here today, and thank you for listening.
Well, thank you all our candidates for their opening statements. We're going to move now to the yes or no phase of the debate. I've been provided 7 questions by the Chamber of Commerce's Legislative Committee. These are questions that speak to much broader issues, but sometimes forcing the individuals seeking office to answer in a very specific binary fashion can help us understand what their positions on those issues are. So each of the candidates has been given a paddle. On one side it says yes, on the other side it says no. And I'm going to ask these questions and ask them to respond simultaneously. I'm going to read the question, and then I'm going to give the candidates a moment to think about what their position might be. And then I'm going to ask them specifically to raise their paddle. So don't feel compelled to raise them right away when you hear the question. I'll give you the key to raise that paddle. So our first question. Are you pro-choice? Are you pro-choice? Go ahead and raise your paddle now. All right. Moving on to our second question. Do you support same-sex marriage? your ballots. Our third question. Did you vote yes on the past ballot measure 2 for the legalization of marijuana? Go ahead and raise your ballots now. Our fourth question. Do you support Mayor Sullivan's proposed resolution to sell solid waste services? Go ahead and raise your ballot now, please. Our fifth question. Do you support the proposed legislation to eliminate daylight savings time in Alaska? That's a controversial one, I can tell. Our sixth question. Do you support the proposed municipal bonds? There's going to be another question about educational bonds. So we're talking in this question about specifically the municipal bonds. Like, raise your ballot, raise your... The question is raised to be inclusive of all. And then more specifically, question number 7, and the last question of this phase of the debate. Do you support the proposed educational bonds? All right, so that gives you some insight in a very quick and dirty fashion of the candidate's position on a variety of different issues. At this point now we're going to move on to an opportunity for them to be a bit more expansive in their answers. I have 4 questions that I'm going to pose to each of the candidates. And we're going to give them the question and then a 2-minute opportunity to provide an answer to that question. This is not a cross-examination opportunity. This is not a rebuttal opportunity where you just that 2-minute opportunity to ask questions. I may follow up with some other prompts myself based upon the answers that they give, but we'll start out with these questions. And Ms. Demboski, I'm going to start with you from this side first of all. So we had a 2-minute answer for this question. What will be your top #1 priority as mayor?
Adequate APB staffing and deployment of those resources. And the reason I say that is because we've seen over the last couple of years, APB's overtime budget has escalated. When we see that as a management perspective, my background is in business development and management. We know when we have overtime budgets that are starting to creep up, it's typically a fundamental symptom of staffing issues. But we also see with the theft unit, with the traffic unit, with the sexual assault unit, many of these different specialty units have been absorbed into patrol. Why? Because we simply don't have enough officers to focus on these issues. With the rash that we've seen of gun violence and drug-related violence, I do think that the gang task force would be instrumental. So I think there are some of these specialty units that we have to revive, but it starts first with adequately staffing our police department. Once we do that, the opportunity to bring down that overtime budget, we've already seen it at the fire department. I passed legislation to address some of the paramedic issues there. So I think when we adequately staff, we'll see the overtime budgets come down, but we'll also be able to have more police officers on the street to address these issues and not be so reactive. Instead, they'll actually have an opportunity to start to go into a little bit of community policing and hopefully curb some of the rising violence that we see today.
We do have some time remaining. Would you like to speak to exactly where you find the funding to do that, given the cuts that we're facing?
Well,
economic circumstances?
I'd love to. I'm going to be the one in the crowd that tells you as a sitting assembly member, I can tell you today we're probably going to have about a $3.1 million surplus this year. But what we also know, as HR managers, as leaders of corporations, when we actually take down overtime money, overtime budgets, and we adequately staff, there's often a balance you can find by adding people. You actually shift the burden from overtime to regular staff. You're not burning out your staff. You're not losing them to attrition. So there's a combination of both.
Thank you. Mr. Halcro, on to you. What will be your top #1 priority as mayor?
Thank you. I think given the condition and some of the challenges the city faces, I think your next mayor has to have priorities, not just a priority. First off, we have to protect and grow the economy, especially in the day and age of $50 a barrel oil. And this includes working with Julie at Visit Anchorage to make sure tourism stays strong. It's about working with Bill Pop at AEDC to get in and look at tax incentives and how tax deferrals might work to redevelop East Downtown, Fairview, and Mountain View to broaden the tax base. More importantly, growing the economy, because we know government's role is to provide a safe and healthy city, is to increase and strengthen the police force. That will grow the economy by simply helping downtown merchants who have been plagued by violence downtown and who have seen their sales drop. The second priority is making the community healthier and safer. And by healthier, I mean, we all know the chronic inebriety problem has grown out of control over the last couple of years. It used to be isolated to downtown, and now the problem goes as far south as Diamond Center. And that's bad, but that also has a little bit of a silver lining, because more people are recognizing the seriousness of the problem of chronic inebriety and homelessness, which gives us an incentive and the critical mass to address the issue. Making the community safer. Again, we're a few dozen officers short on the force. I took a ride-along a week ago Friday. If you haven't taken a ride-along between 11 and 5 a.m., I encourage you to see bar break, to see some of the violence, to see what happens after midnight. There's no question that our police force is understaffed and stretched thin. And finally, the priority has to be managing the cost of government, because we know that cuts are coming from the state. We also know the potential that those costs can be shifted to property taxpayers, and since you're paying 60 cents out of every dollar the city spends on property taxes, it's important we mitigate those cost shifts.
Very good. Mr. Berkowitz, the question is yours. What will be your top number one priorities, man?
Well, I can multitask too, but let's just focus on the top one. The top one is public safety, because that's clearly the prime responsibility of government. And you look at what's happened to the police department in this community. We went from about 400 officers just a few short years ago to 323 on the staff, on the force today. That's not enough. That's not enough for us to do the kind of community policing that lets us have a comprehensive strategy in prevention, policing, and prosecution. And that's an effective strategy that I know works. I know it works from my time as a prosecutor, and I know it works from my time in the legislature, and I know it works by following what's going on with national trends. There was a presidential task force that came out 2 weeks ago about the response to Ferguson, and they emphasized the importance of community policing. And community policing essentially means that not every interaction between law enforcement and the public is something that's going to wind up in a criminal context. It emphasizes the social context. People who have criminal contact with law enforcement, oftentimes there's an underlying issue, drug and alcohol abuse, stress in the families, and we've got to address those. That's a way of reducing costs over a long time, making our streets and homes safer, as well as making sure that we can reduce the amount of recidivism that takes place here. But public safety is far more than just a police department that's restored to full strength with its burglary and theft units, its gang units, its readies back and forth. It's also making sure that we do the things that are necessary with our fire department and with other first responders who are out there. We need to be prepared for whatever emergency might come our way, because at the end of the day, the thing that's most critical that government does is to protect people's lives and properties. And if we can't do that, if we're inadequately staffed for that, then we've been deficient in terms of our responsibility.
Mr. Coffey, your opportunity. What will be your top priority should you become mayor?
Well, I think we all understand full well that public safety is the top priority of any mayor. It's sort of the basic reason for local government. The police department is currently understaffed. The sworn force is 323 today. There's academies going on which will add that. We're also facing a lot of retirement and so on. When I left the assembly in 2010, there were 380 sworn officers, so we've lost 57 now over the years. I've read both the staffing and employment study in 2010 and the department's strategic plan, and over the last several months I've had many discussions with police officers, rank and file, as well as the senior officers about what should and could be done. My plans for the department are really based on those discussions and on the two studies that I've spent a lot of time reading. They're lengthy and detailed, but they show a way forward for us. So my plans for the department is based on those things, and here's what generally I would do. I think we need to build a force to a minimum of 400. The staffing and employment study says you have to have at least that many officers to be able to engage in community policing. Community policing, as noted earlier here, is something that works. It works very well, but you need to have a sufficient force to do it. You can't do it with the force we have today. So, with adequate staffing and officers on them in the communities, we can start to do that. The resources for this, when you name a top priority, then you best be committed to getting that top priority funded. And that may mean what Amy suggested, maybe where there's enough in overtime. I'm not sure that $3 million will give you 57 new officers. So you may have to make changes in what other things we do. And I'm prepared to do that. Thank you.
All right, well, we're going to be returning to public safety in just a little bit, but our next question is going to be addressed initially to Mr. Halcro. We're going to give you the first shot at this one, Mr. Halcro. With decreasing state and municipal revenues expected to continue, how do you propose to address the budget shortfalls that will face Anchorage during your term in office, assuming you're elected?
Thank you. Well, I was in the legislature 15 years ago when oil was $10 a barrel and we had a $1 billion budget deficit. And really today it's the same song, just a different verse, except that verse is not even as pleasant as 15 years ago. As a majority lawmaker in Juneau during that time, I knew full well and had those conversations about where to cut. And as your next mayor, I will know what those conversations are happening. Whether you're talking about municipal revenue sharing, whether you're talking about school bond debt reimbursement, whether you're talking about money from capital grants, there's no question that eventually, in the next 2 to 3 to 4 years, this city is going to start to feel the effects of cost shifts from the state. So it's critical that we have a mayor with a private sector background to be able to manage the budget and still be able to make investments at a time where revenue is falling. And we can address that by doing a number of things. Growing tourism, which pays millions and millions to the city's bottom line. We can redevelop Anchorage and broaden the tax base in undertaxed and underutilized areas like East Downtown and Fairview and Mountain View. And we can build this city to attract the best and the brightest. And I know you have heard that a lot, and that's kind of turned into a cliche, but the bottom line is that the city of the future, the strongest cities in the future are going to be based on 3 things. Talent, the talent of your workforce. Technology, what kind of technology you offer. And tolerance, how together is your community. And with all 3 of those moving forward, we can grow the economy, we can manage costs, and we can do it in a community that is very well polished.
So, Mr. Halcro, I want to follow up on that one. You mentioned that some of your responses were cliched. I'd like to know what industry or economic sector you think would be most likely to come to Anchorage that isn't well represented here yet.
Well, that's one of the things, we get the question a lot about diversifying the economy. And actually, over the last 30 years, the economy has diversified quite a bit since the late 80s. Healthcare, telecom, internet technology. What we need to do is we need to begin relying on that organization that was created to diversify the economy. And that's the Anchorage Economic Development Corporation. For the last couple of years, as president of the Anchorage Chamber, that organization has been completely underutilized. And that is their job, to go out and identify niche industries to broaden the economy.
Thank you. Mr. Berkowitz, same question. With decreasing state and municipal revenues expected to continue, how do you propose to address the budget shortfalls that will face Anchorage during your term in office, assuming you're elected?
Well, you need a comprehensive strategy to know what's going on with the state, but also in terms of local government. But what we can do here is right now, there's 20,000 light poles in Anchorage, and we put LEDs in 5,000 of them. That's saved about $2 million over the last couple of years. Let's put LEDs in the rest of them, in the other 15,000. We've got 179 buildings that belong to the city. The utility bill for them is about $25 million a year. If we just went through those buildings and made them energy efficient, we could reduce that energy bill by about $5 million a year. There used to be this program for procurement in the city called AREBA. And AREBA cost $1 million a year to run, but its first year in operation it saved about $10 million. And the people that ran it suggest that if it gets fully up and operational, it can save $15 to $20 million just by making sure that we're buying the right stickies, the right yellow pads, making sure that we're not using the wrong things at the wrong time. So there are specific places we can go to get efficiencies in terms of of how we're spending our money. But you need to have a results-based approach towards how you spend your money. And I've started a number of businesses. I've helped run a number of businesses. And it's always about results. And we've got to gauge results instead of simply throwing money into the pot. We're a tax-based community, though. That's the property tax base. We've got to expand that property tax base first thing. That means making sure the housing is available for people. So there's more property taxes paid. So more people have housing. That helps solve some of the social problems as well. We need to make sure that we're at the table when the state goes through its round of cutting, because what it's doing right now is just inflicting damage on us. As they cut the troopers, for example, and got rid of the troopers down in Girdwood, that's still a responsibility that we have. That's just one example. There are a lot more out there. We need to be engaged. We need to have our own solutions.
Thank you, Mr. Coffey. If you had the chance to address the declining state and municipal revenue issues, what would you do?
All right, Anchorage has a tax base, property taxes, predominantly, and some others. That's going to enable us to survive the downturn in oil prices and the loss of the state revenue that we've come to rely on in the last few years. The current operating budget of $471 million has four major taxes. Property taxes is 60.7%. That's $263 million. The hotel bed tax has 5.92%, which is $25 million. The tobacco tax pays 5.35%, which is $23 million, and our utilities contribute in a variety of ways, another 4.84%, which is about $20 million. That gets us to 77% of the operating budget. One other major source, in fact, the fifth largest one, is revenue sharing, 3.21%, projected at $13.9 million, and we'll see what comes out of the legislature. My information is that will be going away and will be gone in the relative short term, so we will face that shortfall. Now, we can sustain the loss of revenue sharing. There will be other consequences based on much lower capital budgets and so on. We've got the law that will say we're not going to reimburse for school bonded indebtedness anything after January of 2015. That's a proposal in Juneau right now. We get 55% of the payments for our bonded indebtedness comes from state reimbursement. Take that away for new construction, and the tax rates are going to go up significantly. Okay, my view is that we're pretty well set in ways to deal with it. But we also have to figure out ways to help the city grow. The city's role, as I view it, is as a facilitator and an enabler and a provider of service. We provide financial, legal, and other services to the whole resource industry that supports the state of Alaska. We need to make sure that they can get their folks here, that we've got a good, safe city, we build quality housing, the school district provides a good education, and we maintain the amenities and facilities that make the quality of life so great here. Thank you.
Ms. Bowser, your opportunity to answer that same question.
Can you repeat?
I'd be happy. With decreasing state and municipal revenues expected to continue, how do you propose to address the budget shortfalls that will face Anchorage during your term in office, assuming you're elected?
Okay, great question. So the one thing we have to understand when we start talking about addressing budget shortfalls, really we have two options, right? It's either increase the revenues coming in or it's making cuts, or it's a combination of both. I think it's a combination of both. First thing you have to do is understand your priorities, right? First thing you have to do is right is public safety. Second thing, we have to maintain our infrastructure. Third, we have to make sure kids get a good education. So those are the priorities. That means everything else is on the table. So we have to look at transit. So now when we're looking at transit, we have to say there's opportunities for free market solutions to come in and pick up the opportunity where we leave off in transit. Out in Chiayi River, we have such a limited transit opportunity, yet we have a taxi industry that's fighting us to bring free market solutions into that community. It's the same way in Girdwood. So Uber, yes, I support Uber, but I think we need a fair system for the taxi cab drivers too. So that's one. We have to leverage technology to create efficiencies. In the building department right now, the Assembly has pushed for 2 years to install an electronic plan review system in order to get builders and get through the system faster so they can put people to work and build things. Yet, this current administration, no offense, Mr. Sullivan, but this current administration has had a focus on SAP, and it has drugged resources away from that department in order to implement the system. So it's a challenge for sure. But, you know, we also have to look at these major infrastructure projects. Does anyone in this room think the state's going to give us $300 million for the Port of Anchorage? Absolutely not. But what we need to do is look at that asset and recognize it's a revenue-generating asset. Instead of going to a general obligation bond, why don't we explore public-private partnership? Why don't we explore a revenue bond? Why don't we leverage that asset to pay for the infrastructure upgrades that it needs?
Thank you very very much. We'll move on now to our third question. We've heard a bit already from each of the candidates about public safety, but this one perhaps invites them to go into more depth about how they would address issues of public safety. We're going to start this one with Mr. Berkowitz. So, Mr. Berkowitz, with an increase in crime in Anchorage as of late, if elected mayor, how would you address the broad public safety issue? And more specifically, would you look to reallocate funds that are collected by the Alcoholic Beverage Commission?
Well, look, we just don't have enough cops out there. That's the question that we're dealing with. We don't have enough cops at bar break. We don't have enough cops when it comes time to doing regular patrols in the community. When friends tell me stories about being mugged outside of Nordstrom's, you know that things are out of control. When the mayor himself has to have people removed from the edges of City Hall, we've got a problem. But the problem is more than just a criminal problem. We need to have a police force that's more engaged in part of the community. And when we're understaffed the way we are now, when there's sometimes fewer than 20 officers on the street at a single time, they're in a reactive mode. They're chasing criminals. They're responding to crime. They're not preventing it. So specifically what I would do is I would make sure that we have the resources available so we can do real, genuine community policing, which means integrating the resources available to us, not just APD, but also the U.S. Marshals, perhaps co-management with some of the Native organizations in town, working with the troopers, because the trooper pullback is going to generate a number of difficulties for us. And so we need a comprehensive approach to this. And this idea that we can silo APD and Anchorage away from all the other resources out there, that's a fallacy. And that's a fallacy that's built on the time when money was cheap and easy. But we're over the fiscal cliff right now. And that means we need to be smarter about how we deploy the resources we have. We need to be more collaborative with the agencies that exist, both in the public sector and in the private sector. We need to make better use of things like community service patrol, because the overwhelming number of responses that occur on the streets today are alcohol related. So yes, would I want more money from the alcohol beverage control? Sure. I would want more money from wherever I can get it so we can get the resources that are needed to make sure that this community is safe. That's our first obligation. But we cannot do it if we're more concerned about protecting bureaucracies than we are about providing for public safety.
Mr. Coffey, the question before you. With an increase in crime in Anchorage as of late, if elected mayor, how would you address this public safety issue? And specifically, would you look to reallocate funds that are collected by the Alcoholic Beverage Commission?
Yeah, let me answer that last part of that first. About 12 years ago, an alcohol tax was passed down in Juneau. And it basically was imposed at the wholesale level down low, not collected at the retail level. And today it raises about $40 million, and it's a statewide obligation. And the state, as you may know, can't designate funds, but they did, the people who were behind that tax, and a lot of support was generated for it because of the promise to send it back to the communities. What I don't think all of us understood back then was what that meant was working it through the state bureaucracy of health and social services, and not seeing very much of the money coming directly to the municipality to address those needs that the municipality itself would be far better served to be able to manage and administer itself. So what I've been trying to get those people to do, and spend a lot of time talking to people in the Mental Health Trust and these other and agencies that serve the chronic public inebriates, send us back our share in a block grant or something along those lines so we can build some housing first which truly works and truly saves not only lives but a lot of public money. Look at Carlet Manor, how well that has worked out. We have 46 people off the street. We had to ask 47 of the most frequent flyers, as they call them, to come into Carlet Manor to get 46. There's actual people who are actually recovered from there and are working. That's just unheard of for public street inebriates. There's 8 that aren't even drinking anymore. These are tools that work. So I'd like to get it back in town, and I would like to use it to build some housing first, and that's going to diminish a lot of petty crime and a lot of things that go on in the neighborhoods like Fairview, Mountain View, downtown, and it was noted spreading out towards South Anchorage. If you can get these people in that way, you have a chance of treating them. You certainly have a chance of reducing minor crime, which will allow us to focus more on some of the major crimes.
Ms. Demboski, with the increase in crime in Anchorage as of late, if elected mayor, how would you address this safety issue? And specifically, would you look to reallocate funds that are collected by the Alcoholic Beverage Commission?
I think all options are on the table, quite frankly. The first thing I've already made a abundantly clear, we have an APD staffing issue. We have to address that issue because it's costing us as taxpayers a lot. Not only in the overtime costs, but the impact to the community. When I look at it too, I can't look at these issues in a silo. I look at them holistically. So what we recognize, I was proud to support redevelopment credits in the Fairview area. And it's a program that we're looking to expand throughout the municipality of Anchorage. Why? Because if we can make it cost effective for developers to redevelop, we're bringing more property onto the tax rolls and we are actually reducing the burden to every other taxpayer. So I think we have to look at those. But the other thing, many of us on the Assembly have been very critical of. A couple, I think, members that are standing up here before us today passed the diamond drink. They were advocates of it. And the promises made were that those municipalities would get back some of those tax revenues, and the state hasn't delivered. Politicians need to be held to the promises they make. And we have to do that right first. So am I going to advocate for a new alcohol tax? No, I'm not. Because I think we need to fulfill the promises that were made first. We need to exhaust all other options, whether it's redevelopment credits and taxes, whether it's making sure every other service that we're deploying is deployed effectively. I'm proud of the fact that L.B. Gray Jackson and myself co-sponsored legislation to redeploy public safety resources in a more economic fashion. We expanded the safety patrol. Why? Because it was costing about $330 per call for a 4-man fire engine to respond to a man-down call, an inebriated call. The ASP van, $32.50. That's a better way to spend your money. So we have to look at every single department. We have to find how we're deploying these resources, making sure there isn't a better way. And when there is a better way, utilize it and then transfer those resources over to where they need to be. And that's in public safety first and foremost.
Thank you. Mr. Halcro, would you like a question again?
Please.
Okay. The question is, with an increase in crime in Anchorage as of late, if elected mayor, how would you address this public safety issue? Specifically, would you look to reallocate funds that are collected by the Alcoholic Beverage Commission?
Well, House Bill 225 that was passed in 2002, I was a co-sponsor with Lisa Berkowitz. In the Diamond Drink, we were promised that some of those funds would come back to Anchorage to address the chronic inebriety and some of the social problems caused by alcohol. And that money just went right into the general fund. And with oil at $50 a barrel, I seriously doubt anything's going to change. But let's talk about downtown public safety and alcohol for a minute. We've all read about the challenges downtown. As a matter of fact, a little over a year ago, the Chamber dedicated its January magazine to an entire magazine on downtown and some of the public safety issues. The one great thing about downtown is these are small mom and pop businesses. There's no box stores downtown. So that means these are your neighbors who get up every morning with their blood and sweat and try and grow their business. And public safety is killing downtown, just simply because of the perception. Downtown is safe. But let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, I know you read about it, but you ought to see bar break. These people don't come out of these bars drunk, they come out falling down drunk. And the fact that the police can no longer go in and do bar breaks because the bar owners complained is unconscionable. So what happens is these bad bar owners are over-serving their patrons and then at 2 a.m. shoving them out onto the sidewalk for an understaffed police force to deal with. The recent alcohol tax, my personal belief is any tax that's proposed 60 days prior to an election is more political than public policy. We need to come back and we need to revisit the allocation of alcohol funds once we take the long view and have a long-range plan on how we're going to fund a continuum from detox to job training. Until that time, we can show the taxpayers where this money's going, what it's going to do, and how we're going to be accountable for them. I think it's problematic.
So we've got one more question that we're going to provide the candidates an opportunity to answer, but I wanted to remind you before we move to this next question that I'm interested in hearing what your questions for the candidates are as well. Again, you've got a card on the table. If you would like to fill that card out with whatever questions you might like the candidates to respond to, hold those high above your head and we'll have someone walk around and collect those from you. So our final question of this portion of the debate, we're going to begin with Mr. Coffey on this one. And this perhaps is a good prelude to the next section where we're going to give the candidates a chance to ask questions of each other. But let's start with Mr. Coffey for this one. Mr. Coffey, in 2 minutes, what makes you more qualified to be the mayor of Anchorage than your fellow candidates?
Okay, thank you. Well, I guess you start talking about experience and knowledge and work ethic and the fact that I have been engaged substantially with my community for many years, over 35 years, in a whole variety of public and private endeavors that have related to local municipal government. I've represented clients in the Planning and Zoning Commission. I've been in front of in the permit center, helping people get permits and develop, so they can develop their property and their land. I've worked on major provisions of code that have come here before us, Title 21 being an example. And I've spent 2 terms on the Anchorage Assembly. I was vice chair, ultimately chair. I spent a term on the Planning and Zoning Commission dealing with the whole host of land use and other related issues. Basically, my whole engagement in my professional life has been right here in Anchorage with very little interest that have gone out on statewide issues, although back in the 80s, and this is really related to Anchorage as well, back in the 80s I was on the Alaska Housing Finance Corporation Board when we were repossessing 1 out of every 3 houses that were financed by the corporation and trying to figure out what we were going to do with several hundred trailers that had been financed for 30 years. And those were tough times. I learned a lot in those days. And so I guess what I would suggest to you is that I have a depth of knowledge and experience that I've garnered over time that will enable me to get into the depth of the solutions. And finally, I spent the last 18 months in this campaign meeting literally hundreds of people and dozens of organizations asking about what I have come to call things municipal. What are we facing? How do we address this problem? What are we going to have to do about this, that, or the other thing? My knowledge base when I left the assembly was say this. The last 18 months has made it like this, and I continue to make inquiry daily about things municipal, so that when July 1st comes, if I have the opportunity to be your mayor, I'll know what to do and how to do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Coffey. Ms. Demboski, what makes you more qualified to be mayor of Anchorage than your fellow candidates?
Well, I think, honestly, this is going to be for the voters to decide. I think you have an incredible choice, a cast of characters, if you will, that's here before you. I think they're all bright. They all bring their own unique perspectives. The perspective I bring is I am the only current sitting assembly member running. I know what the issues are today. Though I've been on the assembly 2 years, prior to that, I was the chairman of the city's budget advisory commission. I've served on multiple other boards and commissions. I've had the opportunity to see things municipal for many years. And day one, when I got on the assembly, I had already done a lot of my homework. I had already understood what the issues were. I visited the departments. I talked to not just the department heads. I think I'm probably the only one as a sitting assembly member who's worked at the dump. Why? Because it's important for me to understand what the real issues are, not get the political spin from a director. I look at it like this. I have had the opportunity at the age of 38 to build and manage multi-million-dollar corporations here in Alaska. I have an MBA in finance. I understand the issues today. And I'm proud of the fact that I served with distinction. The people that I've served with are some of the most incredible, bright people I've met. And you have to be willing to listen to people on both sides of the aisle, because you know what? Great ideas can come from anywhere. You have 2 candidates up here that have never served in municipal office. It's not saying it's a bad thing, it's just a reality. The reality is, I don't need 6 months to get up to speed because I know what the issues are today. And whether I'm in the mayor's office or on the assembly, I will never stop working for you. Every single day I get up to serve the people of Anchorage, regardless of who elected me. So I'm proud to stand before you today. And all I say is take a step back, look at people's qualifications, look at the ideas they bring, and ask yourself, is it someone I can trust? Is it someone who has the same vision for Anchorage, something of growth and hope, and somebody who's going to be accountable to you? Because I'm proud to run on my record. It's one to support the taxpayers, and I won't deviate from that no matter what office I hold.
Thank you. Mr. Halcro,
Thank you.
what makes you more qualified to be mayor of Anchorage than your fellow candidates?
I think there's 3 things. There's my community experience, my private sector experience, and more importantly, my honesty. My community experience, I've grown here for 50 years. I grew up on a small street off Tudor Road next to the Tudor Fire Station. Back when Tudor Road was a 2-lane dirt road. Does anybody remember Tudor? Yeah, you do. I drove Tudor Road and survived. I remember those bumper stickers. Over the last 3 decades, I've grown one of the most successful statewide family businesses. Over the last 2 years, I grew the largest statewide business organization in the state. I served 2 years in the state legislature. My final term, I was named not only the best Republican legislator, but the best business legislator. Over the last 2 years, here at the Chamber, we've launched innovative programs, improving public school outcomes and embracing diversity and economic growth with small business. Over the last 2 years, working with members and leaders in this community has shown me things that I never, ever could have learned anywhere else. The experience over the last 2 years, working on everything from the problems in town square, the crimes, the open-air drug use, just 90 yards from the front door of City Hall, listening to merchants, downtown merchants, talk about the impacts of their business on their bottom line after their windows have been shot out, working with local educators on how to improve public school outcomes and improve workforce training, working with our own members on legislative and local issues. These are things that have prepared me. And I believe when you look at my bio, and I think you should go to all the candidates' websites and look at their bios, I think my bio stands out as somebody who's not only has lifetime experience in this community on things like the PTA, serving on different boards and commissions, but also my track record of success in the private sector. And I think that's exactly what we need moving forward.
Ms. Berkowitz, to bring this portion of the debate to a close, we'll give you a chance to respond to that question. What makes you more qualified to be mayor of Anchorage than your fellow candidates?
That's a voter decision. I'll tell you why I'm running and why I think I bring credentials to the race that people should pay attention to. I'm a principled pragmatist. I'm more interested in solving problems and making sure that everyone's treated fairly. That's the approach I'll bring. That's the kind of leadership I'll have. I mean, I can tout my resume. Got an undergraduate degree in government and economics. I've got a master's degree in polar studies. I studied the Arctic and the Antarctic. I've got a law degree. I served as a prosecutor. I had my own law office for a while. I've helped start 3 restaurants in town that employ more than 300 people. I worked on a broadband project trying to bring the benefits of the internet across the state of Alaska. I've done renewable energy projects. I've served on boards like Boys and Girls Club, Special Olympics, Renewable Energy Alaska Community and Schools. I'm a dad. I'm a husband. But everyone in this room can say something like that. Everyone in this room has a story to tell about who they are and how they got to be what they are. My experience in the public sector and the private sector is something I think that distinguishes me. I've earned a reputation in my time in Juneau as someone who stood up for things that were ethical. I stood up on the House floor. Sarah Palin asked me to write an ethics white paper for her. I earned a reputation of being willing to grapple with hard issues because they need to be dealt with in a pragmatic way. But the takeaway from this question, the thing that I want you to remember, is that I am pragmatic and I am principled. And I'll always be accessible to anybody who wants to come talk to me.
Thank you very much. We're now going to give the candidates an opportunity to interact with each other. And so we're going to provide them a chance to ask a question of one other candidate, allow that candidate a chance to respond, and then give the original questioner an opportunity to follow up with a brief rebuttal. I'm going to make one small change to the timing of this. We're going to give the questioner an opportunity to speak for 30 seconds, asking the question to the candidate they'd like to pose it to. A minute 30 for the person who's been asked to respond, and then we'll return to the original questioner for a 30-second follow-up. We're going to start with you, Ms. Demboski. To whom would you like to ask your question, and then what is your question? You have 30 seconds to raise that question.
I will ask Mr. Berkowitz a question. He's piqued my curiosity in some other debates. So Ethan, you've talked about pre-K education and the importance it is to you. My question is, since you vocalized support for expanding pre-K education in ASD, how are you going to pay for it?
Mr. Berkowitz, you have a minute and a half to respond.
Thanks very much. It's not just pre-K, it's also child care. But on pre-K, you look at one of the schools or any of the schools in the school district, they're only used 17% of the time. That's not a very good use of an asset. Municipality has a lot of assets out there. We have rec centers, we have schools. And I think one of the things that you can do as the mayor is make sure that the municipal assets are available to those in the private sector who want to start pre-K or engage in pre-K. And what we haven't done enough in this community is make sure that the city is sitting at the table when the nonprofits come together, which they do on a regular basis, to discuss discuss how they're going to solve problems. Groups like Thread, and I worked with a group called Communities in Schools once upon a time, and that's what you need to do, is you need to use the leadership position of the mayor to advocate for the advantages of pre-K. And I'm particularly troubled at this time because the state is talking about cutting the pre-K. That's a horrible thing to do. It's a bad decision fiscally, and it's a bad decision morally. So where do we get the funding for it? We get the funding by using assets that we already have and deploying them in a more intelligent fashion. We get the funding from it by expanding the programs inside the school district that already fund some elements of pre-K. And we get the funding by partnering with the federal government, with the state, and with the tribal governments that are around us to make sure that we can expand the benefits of pre-kindergarten to everybody who wants it.
Very good. Ms. Demboski, you have 30 seconds to follow up with a rebuttal.
Thank you. Well, one thing we do know, ASD's budget is coming before the Assembly tomorrow night. In it, last year they had expanded pre-K, which has cost millions. And what we do know is ASD has predicated their budget on last year's numbers, which we know is not going to pass. They're not going to have the same levels of funding. So quite frankly, before we start expanding ASD and these programs, we have to do K through 12 right. We have to focus on what is the mission, what is the role, what services are we trying to deliver, and you have to do that before you expand.
Very good. Mr. Halcro, we'll move on to you. Once again, you have 30 seconds to pose a question to one of the candidates. We'll give them 90 seconds to respond, and we'll return to you for a 30-second follow-up.
Thank you. My question is for Amy. Amy, today you've spoken quite frequently about your time on the Assembly and the benefit of that experience. The next mayor will inherit a SAP project that's $25 million over budget. You'll inherit a port project that needs $385 million. Will you give us some specific examples of private sector experience that shows your ability to manage multi-million-dollar projects?
I would love to. So I've had the opportunity, my background is in healthcare, which we know is the fastest growing industry in the state of Alaska. I've had the opportunity to build and manage multi-million-dollar corporations, dentistry specifically, dental offices. And what I recognize, one office, for example, that I took over, originally it was generating revenues about $1.2 million a year. Within 5 years, I was generating $4.2 million a year. So what it comes back to is you have a limited staff, you have a limited budget. How do you leverage those assets in order to generate revenue? So those have been things that have been incredibly important to me. But when we're talking about the city, as an assembly member, one thing I can tell you, I was proud of the fact that I was one of the sponsors that launched an independent review of SAP. Andrew's 100% right. This has been a major problem. But you know, one of the things we're not talking about is that there's a major interface issue between Kronos and SAP. I think the city's missing the boat. I think Kronos has to be addressed. It's not all about SAP. So in order to address these issues, like I talked about, you know, when we're talking about the port, you have to understand it's not about expanding the port, it's about modernizing it and fixing it. And how do we leverage the money that's generated by the port to reinvest it so taxpayers don't have to pick up the burden? I think that's one of the issues. And so I appreciate the question. And like I said, I've had the opportunity over the course of 17 years in the healthcare sector specifically to build not one, but multiple multi-million-dollar companies.
Mr. Halcro, 30 seconds for a rebuttal question.
Thank you.
No? Okay, very good. We'll move on then to Mr. Berkowitz. Mr. Berkowitz, same setup for you. 30 seconds to ask a question to one of the candidates, so 90 seconds for them to respond, and a 30-second follow-up from you.
Well, I don't want my friend Dan Coffey to feel ignored, so I'm going to ask you this question. we talk a lot about the housing shortage in this community, how there's 84,000 millennials coming back and staying here. We talk about how we need to build something like 18,000 units by 2030, and we're only building less than half of it at a time. But specifically earlier on in this debate, we discussed Carlett Manor and housing for people who are coming off the street. There are 46 people in Carlett Manor. What plans would you suggest for expanding the notion of housing first in Anchorage?
All right. First of all, you're going to have to look at the costs associated with housing first. Carlett Manor was a derelict rundown red roof inn on 5th and 6th on Carlett. And it was basically abandoned and vacant. So the cost of land was not there, but what the cost of renovation was. And that was not insignificant, given the age and the deterioration of that situation. So one of the first things I look at is there land available, appropriately located, where you could, and owned by the city, where you could designate that land much in the way we do with Brother Francis and the Beans Cafe, which is also on municipal property. We lease it to them for $1 a year. Why do we do that? The services they are providing are far more valuable than whatever we could get for rent for that place. Now, those places are overwhelmed, but there's other places in town. There's the Alaska Native Service Hospital site. It's 12 acres. It's between Ingram and Eagle on 3rd Avenue. Runs down the hill all the way to what's Warehouse Way, 1st Avenue, Warehouse Way. That might be one. The other is the Clitheroe Center out there by the airport, completely away. You go past the sewage treatment plant, completely out of the way of any other housing or any other development. Either one of those places, if you put that land available, you drop the cost significantly. And then you're talking about stick built, $150 to $175 a square foot. Do the math. You can build multiple units for under $12 million, about equal to the 60% of the money we're supposed to get back from the alcohol tax. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Coffey. Mr. Berkowitz, 30 seconds for rebuttal, if you'd like.
Yeah, the more we can do to expand these programs, the better. When you look at the cost of dealing with people who are characterized as chronic anemias, the term I find somewhat problematic. And it's about $60,000 per person, whereas housing in one of these wet units is $15,000 to $20,000 per person, and that's a significant benefit to us. I think that we can make better use of the Anchorage Community Development Authority, as well as trying to forge partnerships with the Clutha Corporation, who are the largest landowners in the municipality.
Very good. Mr. Coffey, your opportunity to ask a question. You get 30 seconds to do so. We'll turn it over to our candidate of whom you've asked the question. Give them 90 seconds to respond and a 30-second follow-up.
Thank you. Amy, simple question. Do you favor a sales tax or any other new taxes?
No, but I'll expand upon that. What I'll tell you is, I made it very clear, the property owners in this community, we bear a brunt of the load, we really do. But there's only one way I would support a sales tax, and that if it passed by 60% of the voters. So there's no get around the charter on this one. It has to be 2/3 of the voters. It has to directly offset property taxes dollar for dollar, and the third, it has to stand under the tax cap. I think that's the only way to do it. Quite frankly, it goes back to, unfortunately, I have a little bit of experience in this realm, in that I serve on the assembly, and I see some money that we've spent in places where I think we're wasting it. SAP is a prime example. We're up to $40 million on this project, and I'm not confident it's going to work. And so when I see those issues, I feel like if we're not spending the taxpayers' money well right now, why would I ever ask you for more?
Mr. Coffey, you have 30 seconds if you'd like to follow up.
I've stated repeatedly and unequivocally that I don't favor new taxes. If we're coming into a fiscal situation where so much is going to be reduced, we don't need to put another burden on our citizens one way or another. And so I'm very reluctant to do any of that. What I think the focus needs to be is how do we do it better at the city level? Can we do things better and save money by doing them better? That's not easy. It takes a lot of work. It takes a deep knowledge. But that's where my focus would be rather than new taxes.
All right, thank you to all of the candidates for that exchange. We've got a few minutes here. What I'd like to do is pose a couple of questions that have been forwarded by members of the audience. I think I've selected a couple here that both get at issues that haven't quite been thoroughly explored today, and also represent perhaps both sides of both ends of the political spectrum. So we'll give the candidates 15 seconds to respond to these. We'll keep this sort of a lightning round format. And we'll start with Mr. Halcro for this first one. We're going to give the same question to all four. So we'll proceed through them. Again, 15 seconds for a response. The question is this. Every candidate commented on the high cost of police and public safety, but no one mentioned the unions and the high cost of salaries. What would you do to fight for right-to-work legislation?
I wouldn't do anything to fight for right-to-work legislation. Anchorage is the 21st most expensive city in the country. Right-to-work legislation just simply depresses wages and would make Anchorage even more unaffordable and make housing more unattainable, especially for the 82,000 millennials between the ages of 18 and 34.
All right. Mr. Berkowitz, would you support right-to-work legislation?
I oppose right to work and always have and always will.
Simple, straightforward. Mr. Coffey.
My position is real simple. You pick your battles, We've got lots of battles to do, and to pick another fight with the unions is just, at this time, is inappropriate and counterproductive.
Ms. Demboski, every candidate commented on the high cost of police and public safety, but no one mentioned the unions and high cost of salaries. What would you two do to fight for right-to-work legislation?
Well, I'm going to utilize the system that we're in. We're in a collective bargaining model right now. We don't have right to work. Right to work has to be passed on a state level. That's where the battle has to be fought. So, right now, I've already made a promise, and I've already talked to the unions. I'm willing to be open and transparent and work with them.
All right, so for a second question, again, same 15-second lightning round format. We'll start with Mr. Berkowitz this time and proceed through all the candidates. The question this time is, as mayor, what specific actions would you take to rectify the failings of past administrations to ensure the constitutionally afforded rights of equal protection under the law to LGBTQ members of our community? 15 seconds.
I would propose legislation to work with the Assembly to make sure that we treated everybody in this community equally, regardless of who you choose to love or how that love manifests itself.
Mr. Coffey, would you like to hear the question again?
Yeah, I would like to know whether or not we actually and truly discriminate to the extent where we need to have new legislation to protect from discrimination. What I didn't hear, 5-6 years ago, I didn't hear that in 5 days of public hearings. So, show me.
Ms. Demboski, as mayor, what specific actions would you take to rectify the failings of past administrations to ensure the constitutionally afforded rights of equal protection under the law to LGBTQ members of our community?
I've honestly said that I don't believe discrimination exists. I haven't seen it. I haven't seen the LGBT community. When I listened to the testimony from 5 years ago, I didn't see it. Do I think that past administrations have failed? No, I don't. Show me that it exists. I don't see that it does.
Mr. Halcro, your 15 seconds.
Thank you. Over the last 2 years, Anchorage Chamber of Commerce became the first chamber of commerce in the country to do an LGBT outreach. The fact is, there is discrimination, and we are one Anchorage, one economy. We all live in one community. We all shop at the same stores, drive on the same streets, pay for the same city government.
Thank you very much for your answers to those two questions coming from our audience. We are close to the end of our session for today, so we're going to provide each candidate an opportunity to have a 1-minute closing statement. Mr. Coffey, we're going to start with you on this one. 1 minute for a closing statement.
All right. I've been up here all my life, except for education. I was brought to Alaska by Ed and Ruth Coffey when I was 6 days old. We landed at Mayoral Field in an EC3, and we moved into I came into their home on behind Carpenter's Hall down on 5th Avenue and E Street. I watched Al Swalling build what is now known as McKinley Towers. I was 5 years old. So I've seen an awful lot of change and an awful lot of growth in this town. It's a very, very different place from when I grew up. I went down G Street and 15th and H Street and pointed out 24 houses for 24 kids that lived in that 5-block area that I grew up with. That dining didn't exist. So I have a deep and abiding love for this place. It's been good to my mom and dad. It's been good to my family. My friends are still here. I can't imagine not somehow contributing to our town. So the best way I think I can contribute is by being your mayor for the next term. Thank you.
Ms. Demboski, would you like to have a minute for a closing statement?
Ooh, you jumped. Yes, I would love to. I found this has been an incredible experience, not just to be able to serve the people of Anchorage, but to hear from you, to understand what's important. I've had the absolute privilege to not only be a community member, but to serve my other community members. And it really has been a privilege to run with the gentleman to my left. But I do bring a unique perspective. It is one that absolutely has a laser focus on the taxpayers. It has a laser focus on the essential services of government, and that is public safety, infrastructure, and education. We cannot do those things right, though, unless we have sound fiscal policy. It is imperative that your next mayor has a laser focus on the priorities of government and how to deliver those services with finite resources. It's something I'm prepared to do. It's something that I have been doing on the Assembly, working with the incredible people, not only on the Assembly, but within the administration. Anchorage is a great place to live and work and play. And we can absolutely build on that, and we can do it together.
Mr. Halcro.
Thank you. My mom and dad came to Anchorage in 1955 on their honeymoon, and they decided that this is where they wanted to live. And this town has been incredible. incredibly good to me and my family and the people I love. But growing up in this community, growing a family business that today, after 60 years, is one of the largest and most successful in the state, I've come to realize that Anchorage is so special. But there's no question we need a little polish. Public safety, chronic inebriates, improving education, growing the economy. And I think what I bring to the table with my private sector experience, my chamber experience, my love for this community, my vision, I think I'm the best choice. And on April 7th, I would be honored with your vote.
Mr. Berkowitz, 1 minute for your closing statement.
25 years ago, I moved to Anchorage, Alaska. And I moved here and stayed here because it means something to live here. It's why my wife and I are raising our 2 kids here. It's why I invested in this community as a private person, why I've prospered here, why I've been privileged to participate in the public sector. It means something to live here. But we got some rough times coming ahead of us. And until we have a sense of who we are and where we're going again, until we recapture that spirit that means something special to be here and regain that pride of the place, we're not going to make it. So I'm committed to restoring that pride of place, that sense of uniqueness that comes from living in Anchorage. I'd like your vote because I think I share your values of making this a more safe, more secure, and stronger community, able to compete and succeed in the 21st century. Thank you.
Well, certainly one of the constants of the human experience is change, and no doubt Anchorage is currently facing perhaps the peak in the changes that we're undergoing, whether environmental change or economic change or demographic change. We are definitely facing some different times ahead of us. As we contemplate our change, I would like to express our appreciation to these 4 candidates for putting themselves out there, for allowing us to ask